Hey Unwrappers, just before we begin this week's show, I wanted to let you know about the daily digital digests, also from the week. With everything you need to know in one balanced read, the week's daily digital digests give you space to reflect on the news, away from the noise. You can try 6 weeks for free in our winter sale and then save an extra 30% on an annual digital or print and digital subscription. Just enter the offer code WINTER at theweek.com/offer to start your free trial today. That's theweek.com/offer and the offer code WINTER. And now on with the show. It's the week ending Friday the 7th of February, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen Sweden reeling after a gunman opened fire in an education centre, killing 10. A 10% tariff beginning on all Chinese imports to the US, sparking retaliatory tariffs from China, and Beyoncé winning Best Album for the first time at the Grammys. You can read all you need to know about everything that matters in The Week magazine, but we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the Week's digital team, it's a full house, a royal flush of Week staffers. Harriet, Marsden, Jamie Timson, and the boss man, Holden, Frith. Jamie, you're up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
This week we found out that in Kabul, it's just not cricket.
Taliban, they were checking all the hotels and we didn't have any visa. So I just went to Kabul because my captain, she said, come to Kabul, there might be a chance that we get out of Afghanistan. So after 30 days of living with fear in Kabul, I got the Australian visa. The airport was closed in Kabul, so we get the chance to go to the Pakistan. And then from Pakistan, we came to Australia.
A member of the Afghanistan women's cricket team speaking to TNT Sports in a video posted on Friday. Jamie, what's been happening this week?
This week, female cricketers from Afghanistan, it was announced, are to become the first recipients of support from a global refugee cricket fund. The fund, established by the Marylebone Cricket Club, which is based in Lords in North London, and its charitable foundation, will raise money for Pitch Our Future, a programme supporting exiled Afghan women's cricketers in Australia. And that was one of the exiled Afghan women's cricketers speaking that we just heard.
And what's the reaction been to that news, that funding?
It's a small step, I would say, has been towards helping out these cricketers in Afghanistan. Last Thursday, Afghan women's 11 played a 20-over exhibition match, kind of charity match in Australia, which featured a lot of the former Afghanistan women's cricket team. Obviously, since the Taliban took power in 2021, sport has been banned for women in Afghanistan. Alongside this, Afghan women have been experiencing what can only really be described as a gender apartheid in the country. Afghan girls can't go to secondary school, women can't go to public parks, beauty parlours or public buildings. They've been banned from almost all forms of paid employment. Girls are being forced into marriage. And in general, women's voices can't be heard in public. The debate in cricket kind of centres on the fact that the Afghanistan men's team will be playing in the ICC Champions Trophy at the end of this month. And there have been kind of calls from within the UK, within South Africa, a lot of the big cricketing nations for the teams that are playing Afghanistan to boycott in protest at the treatment of not only the Afghanistan women's cricket team, but the women in Afghanistan in general.
Yes, and I think let's just slam on the emotional pedal for a minute here, Harriet, because, you know, this is a story now about, you know, the legalities and logistics of who should ban and who should play and who should fund. But actually, underneath that, the story of these women is extraordinary, isn't it? It is a movie waiting to happen.
Well, it absolutely is. I mean, it's also, I think, worth noting that it's not just true of the Afghan women's cricket team. It's also true of the Afghan women's football team, the basketball team as well. Every woman that participated in any kind of sporting or national competition of that kind, all of them have found themselves either having to flee the country or to go into hiding or fear persecution, even more so than every woman in Afghanistan's experiencing persecution. But yes, I do think that in particular with regards to the women's cricket team, it is a phenomenal story.
Yeah, and how they got out of Afghanistan is a terrifying story, actually, because they, you know, the Taliban were going door to door, hammering on people's homes, and any women who'd played any kind of sport were burning their kits, hiding any evidence of having been part of these national teams that had only very recently been established. They managed to flee Afghanistan, get themselves to Pakistan, and from there, somebody connected with the Australian cricket team heard of their plight and then sort of embarked on a 48-hour diplomatic whirlwind to try and get them out, and managed to get permission from the Australian government to extract the female cricketers from Pakistan and get them set up in Australia.
I mean, Jamie, it just must have been an impossible choice for a lot of those women, and a choice that had to be made quickly about whether to flee the country or not. I mean, you don't go into women's cricket, even in a country like England or Pakistan, to make a lot of money. It's sort of their job, but it's sort of not. And they'll have had families, they'll have had other lives. Yeah,
and I think from a humanitarian perspective, a lot of these women don't know whether they'll ever go back, what situation they'll be in. To use a parallel example, a guy called Henry Alonga wore a black armband while playing cricket in Zimbabwe in 2003 during a World Cup match to signify the death of democracy in that country. He's not been back to Zimbabwe since that moment, basically. He was immediately exiled. He now lives in Australia. There was an interview recently saying that he doesn't know when he'll go home. So, I mean, that is an example of what can happen when you are exiled. And I think for the women involved, it must be an incredibly terrifying and emotionally devastating experience.
I think it's worth saying that, relatively speaking, they are obviously, relative to the women that couldn't get out of Afghanistan, they are the lucky ones. They are now, as much as they are so far from their homes, potentially their families, their friends, they are still free. To a certain extent, they can still do their jobs. They are allowed to speak. They're allowed to go out in public. They are allowed to pursue education, employment in a way that the women who were not able to be repatriated to Australia and who are still in Afghanistan are not allowed to do.
Yeah, and that puts them in a really interesting position, doesn't it, Holden? Because a lot of sports people, we discuss this frequently on the show when stories like this come up, don't want to get involved in politics. They just want to play sport. And yet these women are, interestingly, sort of figureheads for their country, but at the same time very much not. They don't have the Afghanistan flag on their clothes. They have to take a stand.
Yes, in a way they are taking a stand whenever they play, whether they are making an explicit statement about it at all. The fact that they are donning a uniform and taking out cricket bats and playing a game is standing up to the Taliban's idea of what the role of women should be. On top of that, you then have the political debate that they spark by doing so, and that begins to draw in the official Afghanistan men's cricket team, as well as all of the other nations' cricket teams that may be called upon to play them in various tournaments.
Yeah, okay, so let's have that debate then, Harriet. What do you think? I mean, do you think that it's appropriate for individual countries to say we're not going to play the Afghanistan men's team when a lot of cricket organisations say, well, that won't have an impact, it'll only have an impact if everyone does it?
Well, I think leaving aside the question of impact, firstly, I think it's worth saying that England and Australia are some of the countries that already boycott playing the Afghanistan men's team in protest at the Taliban's treatment of women. They already don't schedule any bilateral series with Afghanistan in protest at the regime, but they do play in ICC fixtures like the World Cup, like the Champions Trophy group stage. This is what England is now under pressure to boycott at the end of this month, its fixture with the Afghanistan men's team. So there is a kind of half boycott already in place. So just leaving aside the question of impact, because I do think that's a different question, the outgoing ICC chair did accuse Cricket Australia of hypocrisy over this stance and said, if you really want to take a stand, why don't you boycott the World Cup? Like, why are you only boycotting domestically controlled bilateral series that you can control, but you're not boycotting the ICC fixtures? Then obviously there's another debate about whether the ICC should even allow the Afghanistan men's team to compete at all, considering that their own rules dictate that your country must fund a women's cricket team, which obviously Afghanistan isn't doing. So I think whether or not the boycott would have an impact, to me anyway, it's clear that Afghanistan is in breach of ICC rules, and so it doesn't really make much sense for the ICC to allow them to play in any of the fixtures, whether or not countries boycott them or not. I also think, though, I wonder if there's a danger, I think sometimes, of talking about women's sport in Afghanistan. I wonder if there's a danger in kind of this rose-tinted view of the time between the Taliban regimes. Like, I'm not saying that things haven't got exponentially and horrifically worse since the Taliban retook power, but I think it's worth saying that even in between the regimes when the Taliban weren't in power,
would have been a hard country to play women's cricket in anyway.
Women's sport was not widely accepted in Afghan society. Already female athletes were threatened by extremists. They already had to become ambassadors for their gender as well as for their sport. So I do think it's worth acknowledging that there wasn't like a halcyon era in between the Taliban regimes for women's sport in Afghanistan, or for women really at all.
Why did the ICC refuse to fund the Afghanistan women's team themselves?
The money that's going from the MCC to the refugee charity is meant to be the first funding to try and show that funding can go to these players. The call is that there's like £17 million going to the Afghan cricket, the men's team from the ICC, and the women's team want that money to be funded to go to them, to these charities. I guess the ICC would say that their structure is set up to give to actual cricket nations. I can see that being one of the answers. I think what's also interesting is that actually in interviews, a lot of the Afghan women cricket team don't want a boycott. One of them told ITV News that the boycott is not the right answer. Basically because in Afghanistan, cricket is a big income driver, and they don't want to lose that for a lot of people and families there. So I think there is an element of like listening to the people involved as well. And if they're saying, actually we don't want a boycott, then maybe that's the way. Personally, I think the easiest thing for England to do is to protest during the game, either wearing some kind of T-shirt or a black armband, or making a stand at the beginning of the game before they play. A lot of the time with this kind of thing, embarrassment is the way forward. And if there's a way to embarrass the Taliban on a public stage, I feel like that would be a net positive.
Yeah, because I suppose sporting teams, Holden, don't just represent the regime that runs the country, do they? They represent the people. And for the people of Afghanistan, there's not a lot of joy out there on the international stage. And actually the men's cricket team is something that they probably are proud of and follow. And they may very well have views that there should be a women's team as well. But that doesn't mean the men's team shouldn't be recognised. Yes,
I think that's true. I mean, the men's team haven't really spoken out in support of the women's team, but that would be incredibly difficult for them too, being based in Afghanistan and under the rule of the Taliban. I think it's difficult to embarrass the Taliban. I think that's one of the differences between what we're talking about now and, say, the sporting boycott of South Africa in the apartheid era. The South African apartheid government believed itself to belong amongst the Western industrialized nations, in the sort of Cold War dynamic. It saw itself as being amongst the US, the UK, Western Europe, Australia, and sport was a big part of the national identity there. So when teams were refusing to play the South African cricketers, rugby teams, that had an impact on how South Africans saw themselves. The Taliban already know they're outcasts, and part of what makes them who they are is they reject the idea of an international political community or any kind of secular organisations governing sport or anything else. So I think they are kind of impervious to this sort of pressure. But I do like that idea of the ICC funding the women's team directly. I wonder if the solution is that, as well as funding the women's exile team, they don't fund a men's exile team as well. So then they can play on behalf of Afghanistan. There's lots of Afghan refugees throughout the world. I'm sure there are some great cricketers amongst them. If you then have two Afghan teams, you're not punishing the people of Afghanistan who can still root for the team. You're not punishing other national teams who can play against them. And you would add to the publicity for the plight of women's sport and women in Afghanistan in general, and people in Afghanistan in general. And so that feels like it could have the makings of a everybody wins situation.
Yeah, I mean, this publicity angle is kind of the thing that makes this story special, isn't it, Harriet? Because it's a thing that people who have no interest in global affairs or international politics can understand as a basic injustice. They might follow sport and think, what's that? They're not allowed to play. Like, who's funding them? And it's there. They're in front of you. But is that a good thing? Or should people be reading more about what's happening in Afghanistan and worrying less about what's happening in cricket pitches?
I think that any opportunity to raise the situation of what's happening in Afghanistan is a good opportunity. I don't think it's relevant whether or not a boycott or indeed a ban would have any impact on the Taliban. Like, I believe that, like Holden said, the Taliban is impervious to shame. When you say that they oppose these secular organisations, well, they are also known, a lot of them, to be major cricket fans, and the men's cricket team is an amazing success story over the last few years, despite its complete, almost total lack of funding and domestic support. But that's not a reason not to do it. That's not a reason not to take a stand. Just because you think, oh, well, it won't make a difference to the Taliban whether or not we play Afghanistan in the men's cricket fixture at the end of this month. That's not a reason not to do it. Any chance to raise what is happening in Afghanistan on the world stage is, if you don't do anything, something is better than nothing, right? It's a missed opportunity otherwise. I mean, it is one of the worst human rights atrocities going on in the entire world. And I also think that the IOC, so the Olympics Committee, has kind of found a bit of a workaround that the ICC could try. Like, during the Paris Games, 3 Afghan women and 3 Afghan men were allowed to compete in the Olympics, where they kind of competed as Afghans, but not as Afghanistan, if that makes sense. The Paris Games also banned any Taliban officials from attending. Like, there are things that the ICC could be doing, and it's not to say that they might overthrow the Taliban with shame, but it's better than doing nothing. I also think that there is a risk that we kind of overlook the creeping worldwide sort of semi-normalization of the Taliban that's going on. Like, the Taliban is starting to be brought in from the diplomatic cold. There are certain processes of normalization going on between governments. There are ways in which it is being kind of trying to reestablish diplomatic ties and trying to reinsert itself into the world stage. It's no longer content to just be a pariah. Any way to resist that, I think, any way to resist that creeping normalization that eventually will kind of function as effectively glossing over what's actually happened in Afghanistan and open itself to accusations of sports washing. Any opportunity to do something, I think, is better than nothing.
Jamie?
I think whether or not you really enjoy sport, you can understand the power that it has across the globe. There are very few things that are watched by so many people in so many different areas and countries, and you can go into different places. And I learned a lot about the apartheid through the rugby teams and reading about rugby and learning about the sport and South Africa's kind of role in it. And certainly there are good stories to come out of those from sport. I kind of feel like, in that sense, that the kind of impetus is on everyone that plays sport because of its role in society and around the globe. And I think, while, you know, it doesn't look like England are going to boycott this game, I do hope that they do something to recognise it, because they do have a position of power, and I think that's something that's really important. Okay.
Up next, is it going to be a case of AI men rather than our men? Our new spiritual leaders get computerised after this. Holden, you're up next. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Why Seoul is the new spiritual frontier.
I'm gonna get my fortune read in Korea.
You could be famous.
I could be famous?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
I don't have a boyfriend or a husband?
Your husband let you go.
My husband's gonna let me go?
Yeah.
Like divorce?
Don't drink too much.
Alcohol or water?
TikToker Tiffany Shen getting her fortune read in South Korea last week. Holden, what's the story this week?
This is the opening of what has been described as an AI shrine in the South Korean city of Seoul, where people can now enter what looks like an old-fashioned fortune teller's booth. But when they close the curtains behind them and sit down on the velvet cushion, the only thing they can commune with is a tablet loaded with an AI-powered chatbot.
And is that a publicity gimmick? Is it a engineer showing, look what I can do? Or is it something, do you think, to be taken seriously by this culture that still does turn to fortune telling for religious matters?
It is a little bit hard to tell. We're hampered by the report in the Korean Times having been translated by AI itself, so that makes it slightly hard to interpret the tone. But I think it is intended seriously. It was created by a scientist who's previously worked on high-tech medical equipment. He works for the Korea Advanced Institute of Science and Technology. And that suggests that it is intended to be taken seriously, well, almost as an exercise in computer science. But when you look at how it's being applied and what they're looking to get out of it, it feels as if it has more of a philosophical element to it. And that's part of a trend of people turning to AI with religious questions. And so I thought that's why it made sense to talk about it as something that could have broader consequences for us.
Okay. Well, we'll get on to the broader consequences very shortly. But just to be clear then, what does this thing look like when you go and visit it? And how's it different from going to see a traditional fortune teller within South Korean culture?
Yeah, so outwardly it looks very similar. But instead of talking face-to-face with a person, you are chatting with this tablet, and you give it information about your birth date and time and place, as well as your occupation. And then you tell it what's on your mind, what's sort of causing you concern. And it comes up with responses based on the Korean philosophy of Saju, which from my extensive research seems to be a mix of fortune telling and spiritual guidance, with an emphasis on reducing stress. And it looks as if, the reports of say that people have kind of come to it out of curiosity, but then some of them have found a kind of psychological comfort just in sharing their concerns.
Harriet, people turn to spiritual advice usually for a human intermediary with the divine. Right? I mean, it's part of being human that you talk to another human about something extra human. Does it matter if you take the other human out of it?
I'm not sure you can really say that you're taking the other human out of the equation yet. I mean, until AI...
There's no human there.
Yes, but AI is trained on large language models, which all the material that it's trained on is created by humans. So until AI starts to cannibalize itself, until AI starts to train itself on AI generated content, there is still a human at the end of all of this. And really, I'm not sure if it's substantially different from people using like online research tools to navigate spiritual texts and philosophical questions. Like, obviously there are massive ethical implications, but in terms of taking a human out of the equation, I'm not sure we can say that has happened yet, technically speaking.
I mean, I don't know much about Seiju either. I've just read about it from this article, so apologies to any Koreans listening who do understand a lot more about it. But broad brushstrokes, it does seem to be a slightly more mathematical kind of formula. It's more like a kind of card reading where, you say this, that happens. It kind of makes sense that it could perhaps be algorithmically interpreted. But Jamie, when it comes to other religious texts, the Quran, the Torah, the Bible, do you think that we could be seeing a boom in AI spirituality there?
Yeah, definitely. I think what's interesting about the kind of effect of AI on religion is that obviously, when you think about monks or priests or anyone that's giving sermons, a lot of what they're doing is interpreting scripture written, over a course of a huge amount of time. And what these large language models are able to do is ingest all of that scripture, and they can create their own sermons. They had lots of different examples, but there was one in the New York Times that they've written about recently, which was a rabbi bot, which was a kind of custom large language model that was created by Rabbi Josh Fixler in Houston. And he says he doesn't use the AI to write the portions of the sermons, but he does use it to basically, he's trained it on 20 years of his own writing, and it helps him with research and everything. His reason for not using it to write the sermons is that he's aware that people are coming to his sermons because of the human angle of it. I personally I can see the positive sides to all of this. One of the things that I was reading was saying that, obviously, if you're giving everyone all of the information from Christianity or ingesting it into a large language model and then creating something, there's inevitably going to be a kind of driving people to the average and to the kind of less polarizing, less extreme. So somewhere years in the future, if we are being preached to by the AI, there's a chance that it would be more centrist, I guess, and less extreme. And extreme fundamentalism is obviously an issue. I did have an image there in my head of Alistair Campbell and Rory Stewart and AI versions of them disagreeing agreeably.
I didn't know that their podcast had raised to the status of religion yet.
Have you seen, they're selling out the Albert Hall, mate?
I mean, one of the questions I suppose that Christians often ask, literally, Holden, is what would Jesus do? So, I mean, you can imagine, can't you, this use in a GPT bot. My wife's cheating on me. What would Jesus do? I mean, I suppose that is what a priest does. They interpret the scripture and say, well, this is what I think our religion tells us. But the concern is that you act upon what a large language model is coming up with.
Yeah, I think it's really hard to know what the outcome of this would be, and whether it is a kind of pulling of people towards the centre, as Jamie suggests, or whether it could actually end up bypassing the filters and softening that a lot of human priests and sort of intermediaries might place on the Old Testament, for example, or the Quran, when they're looking through it for examples of adapting teachings written centuries, millennia ago to the modern day. If you are just sort of unleashing a large language model on that, it could end up presenting ideas that don't really fit with what most of us would like to see in the modern world. And, you know, that could have a radicalizing effect. It could also actually serve to undermine religion and kind of push people away from it and sort of expose some of the contradictions and unpleasantnesses that those who like to follow religion, find value in it, are able to gloss over it because a lot of the texts are relatively inaccessible.
But is that necessarily a bad thing, Harriet? Like, if a computer can manage to unearth exactly what the Bible does say or what the Quran does say about certain situations, and people don't like the answers because the answers are, well, homosexuality is wrong, or in this extreme case, I think it is right to kill that person, and that is what our religious text says, isn't it better to have an open conversation about that's what the old religious text says than kind of, as Holden says, kind of modifying it and making it fluffy?
Yeah, I do think that it's interesting that a lot of the conversations we have about these AI bots, we could have the same conversations about Google or the internet in general. And those conversations were had. I mean, the internet changed irrevocably the way people interact with religion, religious texts, the way kind of certain religious movements spread online or are interpreted online, or the way Bible passages are interpreted online, for example. And also there is a question of accessibility. I mean, some of these religious texts are incredibly long and incredibly complex, and demystifying those texts and lowering barriers and improving accessibility. We were having similar conversations about how the printing press was going to devalue religion when it started mass producing the Bible, or when the Bible was suddenly in English and sermons were in English instead of Latin, so more people could understand them. I think one of the interesting things is one of the major uses in AI and religion at the moment apparently is pastors using AI to translate their sermons in real time into multiple languages. So that's not necessarily that you're replacing the human element, and it's not necessarily that you are risking interacting with a bot discussing matters of faith or matters of philosophy. That's literally just using AI to translate in real time. And another one I read about, actually, one of the churches in the US that has begun to use AI, they said that the biggest thing that they're having people ask the AI bot on their website is what time the services are. You know, so it's like some of these conversations, I think, kind of scatter on ahead, when actually a lot of what AI is being used for is the same thing that we have been using the internet for nearly 3 decades, or what we've been using the radio for, the television for, in the whole last century. There was a big investigation about so-called Jita GPTs. These are bots in India. There's a big business in India. Bots that are trained on like 700 verse Hindu scripture that speak to you in the voice of Krishna, and you do actually ask, and Krishna responds to you. And this investigation found that these bots had absolutely no filter for like misogyny, for example. But then again, neither do humans necessarily. Like, a lot of the ethical implications or concerns that people have about AI in these situations can also be applied to human spiritual leaders. And there's also very good reasons why people might not feel comfortable approaching a human member of the clergy, like a human member of the Catholic priesthood. There might be really good reasons why you might feel slightly wary about approaching them too. So I think obviously AI is not infallible, and there are massive ethical considerations and concerns, but so are there about humans.
I suppose the other kind of filter as well that's worth thinking about, Jamie, is something that talks to the amount of time people spend with these AI guides. You get this with AI girlfriends and boyfriends, don't you? People become obsessed. You can imagine that people would be asking everything to ChatGPT.
Yeah, and I think the Israeli philosopher Yuval Noah Harari, he's warned that, you know, ultimately we're going to start seeing AI as a deity, and probably could at some point compose its own religious texts and then attract worshippers of AI. I mean, there's not that much of a difference between the deities in religion and the ideas of what AI will become in terms of generative AI and the future. And that, you know, will have massive consequences. You know, it doesn't need to be telling people to go out and hurt or harm for people to start reading into these things in that way. But I kind of tend to move towards the positive in the sense that I think maybe a new religion created by AI could make the world a better place. You know, there's a lot of doomsday worries about AI, but many older faiths are losing relevance at the moment. In an era of rapid technological change, an AI god or an AI religion would have a much better understanding of that and that world. Also, you know, the majority of religious believers are peaceful. So
yes,
you'd assume.
I mean, I suppose that's actually maybe quite a nice, reassuring thing, Holden, is that if we do get to the situation where search engines allow you to, you know, ask capitalism, but also ask religious texts for the answer, you know, you might be saying, where's the best value house in this postcode? And the answer might be, we believe material things are less important than looking after your friends and neighbours. I mean, we could have quite a nice world.
Yeah, I think that that gets to one of the differences between AI bots and Google or the printing press, although I think those are useful comparisons. And, you know, the printing press was a huge part of why the Reformation took hold in sort of disseminating information and giving people direct access to religious texts. But now, you know, we're at the very early days of AI bots. They're going to become much more powerful than they are very quickly, I think. You see the progress that's happening even now. And it's sort of odd to imagine that AI could sort of take on some of the role that religion has in trying to kind of help people search for meaning beyond the, you know, what time is the sermon happening, or where's the best school for me to move next to. But I think the way AI works, because what it effectively does is take the full sum of human knowledge and, you know, everything that humans have ever recorded, knowing, feeling, believing, predicting, breaking that all down to its component parts, and then sort of trying to assemble them in response to a prompt that you give it. That means it has much more flexibility than the old tools we have. And some of its weaknesses for journalistic research, you know, the hallucinations that it comes up with, the kind of random and slightly disconcerting flights of fancy, I think that actually might make it feel even more powerful if you are looking for some sort of spiritual guidance. Like it gets beyond just a kind of mechanical assembly of facts, and it will be able to present things to people in a way that appeals to their cultural frame of reference and, you know, their interests, their ability to grasp it. That could be used for ill, or it could be used for good. And I think I would also tend to say that for the vast majority of people, that's going to be something that's very interesting and potentially powerful too, because it gives you access to all that knowledge, but it gives you a sense of mysticism and depth that you're not going to get from a Google search.
It could make a lot of money as well, couldn't it, Harriet? I mean, religion is big business.
It's a huge amount of money involved in India in particular. I mean, we're talking millions and millions of rupees. It's incredible. And I think that's something really key about what Holden said, that the morality of these tools is not in the tools themselves, it's in who uses them and why. Because I think when we talk about AI and AI bots, we always sort of talk about them as if they're kind of disconnected from the world, as if they're sort of this ephemeral thing that happens in the air, but they are rooted in reality. They're rooted in software and engineering and programmers, and people have the ability to gain control over this type of technology. People do. Certain engineers and certain software developers, they actually develop these bots. There are people involved in this process. There is no reason to think that an AI bot like a Jita GPT, for example, couldn't be effectively taken over by a nefarious individual. You know, technology is susceptible to all sorts of attacks, and it's weak and it's vulnerable to human enterprise as well. So I would say that I'm less concerned about the potential ethics of the AI as I am about who might use it and for what purpose.
Ultimately, though, Jamie, I mean, maybe this frees up more time for the clergy, as you were suggesting earlier. But, you know, who do you want holding your hand in your deathbed saying your last rites? It's not going to be an AI bot.
No, I guess not. It depends. Not currently, but I think probably as we move further and further to transhumanism, which is the idea that basically humans and robots will merge, certainly that's the guy called Ray Kurzweil, who's one of the most preeminent scientists in this field, thinks that transhumanism is the way forward. I can see a situation in a world where you've got AI-driven humans holding your hand as you die, Ollie.
I'm not going to ask what Jesus would have made of that. Up next, rat-a-tat-tat, the rodents who are right under your feet as we talk. That's after this. Okay, Harriet, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Are we headed for a rat summer?
In New York City, rat news, which is most New York City news, young lady. The rodents have apparently gnawed through the Big Apple's rat-proof new trash bins. Okay, so that solution didn't last long. According to one expert, it's no biggie, saying evidence of rodents chewing through garbage cans is not necessarily a bad sign. It means the animal is stressed. Well, in that case, fantastic.
The Late Show with Stephen Colbert on Tuesday. Harriet, tell us what is going on in rat news.
Well, normally we're talking about all the ways in which global warming and human urbanization is really bad for animals. So it's quite nice this week we're actually talking about one species of animal that is really doing quite well out of it, and that is rats. So last Friday, this incredible, huge study was published using public sightings and inspection data from 16 cities around the world to estimate trends in rat populations. And they found that over the past decade, most of those cities had seen this significant increasing trends. And the ones that had bigger temperature increases and higher population increases had bigger increases in rat populations. And one of the worst affected cities, Toronto, is experiencing what one of their city councillors last year called a perfect rat storm of conditions.
Oof. So what problems might that create for the people of Toronto and New York, for example?
Well, like we were seeing in the clip in the opening there, rats cause billions and billions of dollars in damage. They can lower the value of properties, they consume agricultural yields, contaminate food supplies. Actually, the study put a number on it. They estimated that in the US alone, rats cost $27 billion in damage every year. They have teeth that are as strong as steel, and they can gnaw through concrete even. You know, they cause more, like half of all animal damage to vehicles in the UK, and they infect engines, they gnaw at fuel hoses.
You're sounding very anti-rat, if I may say.
I'm actually not. I think one of the really interesting things about this as well is how much it highlights that rats are doing so well out of climate change. Like the study highlighted that rats are on every continent except for Antarctica. They're like a global species. They're incredibly well adapted for all sorts of different environments. They also, one of the problems that the study highlighted was because of global warming, because of rising temperatures, they can be foraging outside for longer, they can breed for a longer period of the year, and fewer of them die in the winter. And they're so fertile, they can have litters every 3 weeks of up to 14 babies, and they're incredibly intelligent as well. So they're like this super species effectively that might be like with the cockroaches, they might be the only ones left standing after the apocalypse.
Jamie, do you agree with Harriet's assessment of the trend? Basically good for rats, bad for us?
Yeah, I saw this thing. There was like a rat that was like a really good chef in Paris. Did you see that? Was like
incredibly adaptable.
I think that's an upside to the rats. We had rats in our flat actually last year. Glasgow has 45% more rats than in 2019, which is where I currently live. And there's been more than 100 residents in Glasgow that need hospital treatment after rat attacks.
What?
Yeah.
What do you mean? What happens when rats attack?
Aggressive rats bite you, and then you need to go to hospital.
Oh, well, like when you're in bed or something?
They go out to the bins,
right,
and there are rats, and they jump up and they bite you, and then you have to go to hospital. No one's died yet, but some of the things are quite serious. But on the flip side, Rachel Heaton, who's a publicity officer for Yorkshire Rats Club, That's a job, isn't it? She's an owner of 15 rats, and she told the BBC that rats are really affectionate and so in tune with their owner's emotions. When she had her appendix out, one of her rats could sense that she was unwell, and instead of trying to play as they usually do, he just sat and quietly licked her hand.
Maybe what we need is Rat GPT. Then we'll
that's
solve
good.
all
We should draw a distinction between domestic rat species kept as pets and what we're talking
don't be
about,
all
which
fair
is
to rats
urban
now.
rats. It's actually a different type of rat.
There's a very anti-rat agenda. You can also teach them to do tricks. There was one woman who taught a rat to fetch her a tissue every time she sneezed.
Holden, how are cities around the world coping with this rat infestation? Because it's not as straightforward as full elimination, is it?
No, it isn't. I mean, that has been tried many times, and perhaps most graphically and extensively by Paris in 1920. There's a lovely article, more lovely than you'd expect in an article about rat extermination, in the Telegraph, written by Joe Shute. And he says that in 1920, the city had become particularly infested with rats. The theory was that the vast rat population from the trenches on the Western Front had found their way into Paris. I don't know how robust that connection is, but wherever they had come from, there were a hell of a lot of them in the city, and the French authorities effectively declared war on them and encouraged vigilante groups to go out with clubs and knives, dogs, even guns, to try and kill as many of them.
That is the scene I wanted in Ratatouille. But hold on, I asked you what cities are doing now. You're giving a history lesson from over a century ago.
So this seems to have, the fact that this completely failed, this has influenced what Paris is now trying to do, and they have declared a new policy of what they call cohabitation, which confusingly is also the term they use to describe Emmanuel Macron working with a prime minister from a different party. But in both cases, the idea is that each side gives a little ground and they try and get along with each other. Generally, the view is that if you try for extermination without removing the root causes of what attracts them in terms of kind of food, rubbish, litter, because of how quickly they breed, they will just rebound to fill that space. So instead, if you kind of accept that there will always be some rats, but just try and minimise the encouragement you give to them, keep rubbish in rat-proof containers, try and do something about litter, don't leave food lying around, then you will just sort of keep the rat population to a smaller level, and you just have to kind of accept the fact that they are going to live in those habitats we've created for them.
Yeah, I mean, one thing as we were hearing in that clip, Harriet, was that New York have been trying rat-proof rubbish bins, but they're obviously not working.
Well, they're working better than what they were doing before, which to us seems like unhinged, is that they were just throwing bags of rubbish onto the pavement without putting them in any kind of containers. Mm-hmm. So it is still an improvement. New York City actually appointed its first so-called rat czar back in 2023. And last year, the mayor declared rats public enemy number one. So it does kind of seem like they're taking a Paris mindset there. But as Holden was saying, the attempts for decades to kill rats, so with lethal traps and poisons, haven't worked at all. In fact, actually, they've done a lot of damage. Like, a lot of the poisons kill other local animals, and also rats are becoming genetically resistant to poisons, which is actually helping them become stronger and bigger. And they are also becoming bigger and stronger as well because they're feeding off more available food sources, more fatty food takeaway, that kind of thing that's left around. So that's what New York is doing. They've also piloted greenlit a pilot program for rat contraceptives. So they're hiding what is effectively like the rat pill in like a little piece of chum. New Orleans actually had the biggest decrease over the study period, and that's because they're taking really proactive rat activity surveillance. Like, they're proactively finding rat infestations, and they're also kind of educating other departments on control options as well. More of a cohabitation preventative mindset rather than raticide, which has completely failed everywhere you look.
What do you want, Jamie, in our cities? Should Sadiq Khan get a rat czar? Should Andy Burnham get a rat czar?
Yeah, given, as I discussed earlier, that Glasgow is considerably more ratty than it was before, I think I would just like my bins collected more often.
Yeah, well, it's genuine sort of hot topic this week, isn't it? Brighton Council, is there at Bristol Council trying to stop the amount of bin collection?
Honestly, I need to start up my own Glasgow-based version of this podcast, but they barely ever collect our bins, and it does just cause a massive distress when you're outside and you're just thinking this is really horrible. But once they're outside, I'm more towards Holden's Macron thing of just letting them live, and there's something quite kind of stoic and poetic about just being like, you know what, we're always going to have rats, and that's okay. And you just got to live and let live.
That does seem actually very French now you put it like that. When it comes, Holden, to the rats that are around us, though, that we may not be aware are there, that's another concern, isn't it, when you start reading into this stuff? Because they are in your flat. They are in your house, right? They're everywhere. You just don't see them.
Yeah, and the ones that we do see are usually the outliers, the sort of stragglers that come out in the daylight and are bold enough not to disappear when they hear you coming. They may be ill, they may have been cast out of their colony, they may also be more aggressive. I mean, rats aren't generally aggressive, but if they feel that they're cornered, so for example, if you do kind of disturb them in the bins, then as Jamie says, they may well attack you, and they can jump a long way, up to sort of 3 or 4 feet, so they can get you in the face if you're very unlucky. But we actually don't know as much about urban rats as you might expect, given how close we live to them. But the fact that when people do notice them, they generally want rid of them, they don't want to study them, does mean that we don't have a huge amount of data on how they behave. They're also quite difficult to track using the sorts of methods that scientists generally would employ. You know, if you're trying to study field mice or meerkats or something, you put little GPS radios and then you can see what they're doing, where they're going. But for animals that live amongst kind of concrete steel foundation, those signals just don't get through. There's a lot about how they interact with us, why they're so successful, that we don't entirely understand.
And finally, Harriet, you suggested the link to climate change as you introduced this topic. Is that something that, should this story be folded into people's efforts to resolve that issue, to reduce global warming? Do you think it's something that could win more people over to cutting emissions?
It certainly could. I think one really interesting thing that came out of my research this week was how bizarre it is how much these rats, people hate rats. Like, as Holden was saying, they're incredibly mysterious. We have very little data on urban rats over the past 70 years because people hate them so much. They provoke such a visceral reaction. The presence of rats, it takes a noticeable toll on the mental health of people who come into contact with them. That's how much humans hate rats, which I find so deeply fascinating because they are such a successful, intelligent, actually fundamentally quite incredible species. They are also very dangerous. The diseases that spread through rat urine, leptospirosis, for example, is estimated to cause like 60,000 deaths a year. In terms of climate change, the human population living in cities is only going to increase. It's projected to increase 25% by 2050. There's not really an option to just live and let live with rats forever, indefinitely, because this problem is only going to get significantly worse. The so-called war on rats, the study said, is costing an estimated $50 million a year. That's actually quite a lot of money. So if you think that temperatures are only going up, cities are only getting more urbanized, and the populations in cities are only getting bigger, then if rat populations are getting exponentially bigger, there is a scenario you could envisage in which they kind of overtake the human population. Like, I grew up in London, so I have a very different kind of interpretation of rats. Like, we were always told you're never more than a few feet from a rat. We were also always taught that if you saw mice in a restaurant, hotel, wherever, it was really good because it meant there were no rats.
Let them have it. Let them have, like, we might as well just let the rats have this place. It can't be any worse than what we've done.
Well, there was one thing that I thought I just wanted to end on, is how unifying the rat problem actually is. Because although rats disproportionately affect poorer neighbourhoods, the study saw the same increase in population in rich and poor areas. And you can't just tackle this problem in rich areas, because then you create this sort of sink and source habitat patchwork of rats. So it's quite unifying. This is a problem that's going to affect absolutely everyone.
I foresee a political party running on the redistribution of rats.
My thanks to Harriet, to Holden, and to Jamie. You can follow this show for free. You can get every episode as soon as it's released, like a rat up a drain pipe, by searching for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts and tapping follow. You can also get 6 free issues of The Week magazine with a trial subscription if you go to theweek.com/subscriptions. In the meantime, I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Ollie Peart at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to Unwrap next week, bye-bye.